listening to the Three Seeds Podcast, a show about native plants in the Midwest. I'm Stephanie.
And I'm Elizabeth, and we've been walking around parks and gardens together for years.
In each show, we share interesting and fascinating facts about native plants.
Why 3 seeds? Well, we believe it takes 3 seeds to germinate great ideas.
We're 2 of the 3 seeds, and the third may very well be a plant, a person, or a cultivar.
Oh, no.
Just kidding. We are here at yet another Chicago Public Library location, the Sulzer Regional Library. Fantastic place, made even more fantastic by the lovely Angela Bowman of Bowman Gardens.
Thank you for joining us.
Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
So, Angela, can you tell us a little bit about what you do?
Sure. So I am an ecological garden designer. I have a business that's called Bowman Gardens, and I design and install gardens that focus on the use of native plants and also working in harmony with ecological processes. So a lot of our history of gardening in this country and in the West has focused on like beating back nature, bringing in plants from elsewhere, adding a bajillion things to the surroundings to make those plants happy, and beating nature into submission. That's hard on the earth. For me, it's really demoralizing actually to work that way, and it takes a lot more fussing and busy work. Whereas if you kind of harness things like stormwater, soil microbes, insects, right? I mean, you know, gardeners used to think of insects as like just 100% enemy to be gotten rid of, except for the few quote unquote beneficial insects, which is, guess what? Most insects are beneficial. You know, yes, there are some insects that are pests, but there's a balance to be had, and the more that we can look to nature and natural plant communities for our cues in gardening, the more our gardens will contribute to nature and habitat. They will also be extremely beautiful. They'll be less burdensome to the environment, and they give us a greater sense of place and connection with our own natural environment. So to me, that is super, super important, is just helping people connect with plants. And for a lot of people, especially people who live in urban and suburban environments, the garden is the first place that they know plants. And so it is a great point of entry for understanding ecology and the natural world, and that's where people fall in love with plants. And we all need to be in love with plants.
Right. Even just for our own future on the
Absolutely.
planet. Yeah.
We depend on it, you know, and there's no life without plants. A lot of the problems with our climate and natural regulation have to do with abuse of plant communities, you know, removal of plant communities, whether it's rainforest or like ripping up topsoil. I mean, there's a million ways that we have caused harm, and to start to tend to those communities, recreate them, or build communities that serve similar functions, it's really essential to our future.
Mm-hmm.
And it feels good.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
I mean, it really feels wonderful, and I think there's a resurgence of gardening right now in our society. COVID actually was a really big boost to the landscaping industry because people had to be outside to socialize. They realized that it actually is really nice to be outside, and you know, that was a time, I remember that first spring in 2020, like the world is falling apart around you, but I could put these little seeds in my window and they were gonna grow, you know? And it just feels really good to be connected to living processes in the face of other difficulties.
Yeah, and when you have your own garden, then you get a chance to really spend more time with it than you would, say, just visiting parks. I feel like you get to observe it, long term, but also day to day see the difference in the garden and in what insects are coming by.
Yeah, I mean, that closeness, but I would actually argue that if you live near a park, you can still experience that in the gardens at the park too, or in your neighbors' gardens. I mean, I feel like front yard garden, I had someone one time who was visiting from San Diego, and she was commenting on all of the front yard gardens in Chicago, which I just sort of take for granted, and partly because, we don't have as much space. If you want a garden, well, it's going to be in the parkway maybe, or in the front. I think that is a wonderful thing. And when you garden, especially in your front yard or in your parkway, that is a public service.
Yeah, you're sharing it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How long have you had your business?
My business just for a little under 3 years. So I've been gardening my whole life, and my mom was a gardener, and she actually had a garden business with her best friend for a year or so, and then my mom stopped doing it, but her best friend continued to do that for her entire career. So that was a great role model for me. And when I was in college, my roommate was a conservation biology major, so she started teaching me a lot about native plants, and I started to get really interested in that. Then when I came back to Chicago, I had another really great friend who was a gardener, and she was a master naturalist, so she also knew a lot about native plants. So that was the time that I started trying to incorporate more native plants into my garden, and the more that I learned about it, the more I tried to do that and was interested in it. And then, I used to work in publishing, and I was pretty burned out, so I needed to do something different. And so in 21, I left publishing. Actually, I continued pursuit of a garden design certificate at the Chicago Botanic Garden. But I also went to, I read a lot, went to a lot of conferences about ecological landscaping and garden ecology. And so I knew that is what I wanted to be the focus of my business.
We're very curious to talk with you because I feel like this time of year, the winter, this is the time for planning.
Yes.
And thinking about things.
Yes.
And so my question is a true or false question, which is a native garden is a messy garden. True or false? We also don't have to go there if it's like a weird question.
No, I do want to go there. That's I really, really want to go there. Because it is a great misconception that if you're gardening with native plants, that it requires no maintenance. You just set it and forget it. I've had people say that to me, I just want a garden where I can set it and forget it, And there is no such garden in the world. And in fact, even if you're creating a natural area, if you're doing ecological restoration, you can't set it and forget it. At this point, there are so many factors that have been introduced, so much disturbance and so many factors that have been introduced by human beings that, we have a ton of invasive species, and, habitat has been fragmented. And the other thing is that actually humans have been intervening in nature for like tens of thousands of years. The prairies exist because indigenous people were burning them and clearing them. The prairies are a result of human interaction with nature. So we're a part of nature, and the idea that nature just kind of carries on its merry way without us, and when Europeans came to this continent and they had this idea of pristine wilderness, well, that was actually wilderness that had been carefully managed by people for thousands of years for the purpose of farming or hunting. And it looked different than European cultivated land, but it was a result of relationships with humans. And then consequently, native plants get a really bad rap in some quarters. And there are a lot of people who are very attached to an orderly garden who see somebody who has just blithely put in a bunch of native plants and forgotten about it, and it gets really tall and you can't tell what's what, and probably there's a lot of invasive species that are growing in there in the meantime, because if you don't pay attention, especially in the early stages of a garden, that's going to happen. So then what you have is people who think, oh, native garden equals weedy mess, we can't have anything to do with that. And worst case scenario, you actually have cases where there are municipalities that are like outlawing rain gardens because in their experience, a rain garden looks like a disaster. It's like a trash pit, Now, that's not because it's a rain garden, it's because it hasn't been well managed. So yes, it is true that a naturalistic garden, a garden that emulates natural plant communities, will not be as tidy and static as some traditional gardens that we have grown up with. And the idea of a garden that has to be managed so that it stays the same every year, that has a sea of wood chips in between plants that don't touch each other. I mean, you can have a garden like that with native plants. You can have any kind of garden at all you want with native plants. It just has to do with how you manage it.
Yeah, you're talking about management, which means human intervention. So let's go to that next level with human intervention design.
Great.
Let's talk about design tips. What is it, sort of this communication between you and the client about what they want aesthetically? Or do you kind of come to them with ideas on texture, heights, composition? How does it?
Or even like, what are your tips for
Just-
everybody?
sure.
Like those ones that are like, this applies to pretty much every garden that you design.
Right. Well, let's just start with the concept of design, which is really about solving for objectives, no matter what you're designing. If you're designing a piece of software, if you're designing a piece of clothing, if you're designing a house, if you're designing a garden, the first thing that you have to do is identify your objectives. And so when someone comes to me and we want to talk about their garden, well, what is the purpose of this garden for you? Is this, you want a place to hang out with your kids? Is it something that you want to be a display in the front of your house that will be very inviting? Is it a private sanctuary in the backyard? Do you have problems with flooding that you need to deal with through landscaping because you're getting water seeping into your basement every time it rains because the landscape is graded towards the house and you have nothing but shallow rooted turf grass? Those are all considerations. And you want something that's beautiful. What do you want something that you're gonna like be very involved in or be less involved in? Are you gonna have someone else take care of it? Are you gonna take care of it yourself? Do you have dogs? These are kind of all the questions. People who come to me are a little bit self-selecting because they know that I do ecological design and with native plants. So people who really want like a lot of very formal bedding annuals, like those people aren't really calling
They're
you
not
to
knocking
begin
on
with.
your door.
Yeah. So the first step in the process has to do with arrangement of space, and that is not only about plants, right? But then let's say we've sorted for all of that, and so part of what I try to suggest to people is that in addition to having plants in your garden for enjoyment, for cooling, maybe for eating, is it something that you want to cut? That another objective for a garden should be to provide habitat for birds, insects, all of the microbes in the soil, that you should be kind of trying to harness some of these natural processes to have a community that's basically more life-giving and less burdensome.
But just as you're saying all of that,
Yeah.
that sounds like super overwhelming, and I think it sounds beyond reach for a lot of people, like, to think about so many different things, to think about, oh my God, how am I going to change the microbes in the soil? You know what I mean?
Right.
Are there a few things that when you suggest this as a tip or something that you feel confident that this is going to help somebody feel like a little bit of success in what they're doing?
Yeah. Oh, great point. One of the first things that I would suggest to people is to plant densely So ultimately, you want to have every square inch of your garden filled in with plants. You do not want to have space, mulched space between plants. You know, a lot of people put down wood chips and they think it looks tidy and it keeps the weeds down. Well, the best thing to keep the weeds down is other plants that will outcompete the weeds. You know, nature abhors a vacuum. So open soil, everybody's soil has millions of weed seeds in it. That's the seed bank. So it has seeds of all kinds, and there are certain kinds of seeds that really, really do very well in the condition of the open space in between the plants that you planted in the garden, you know, and that's actually as nature is like trying to heal itself, because soil needs to have plants in it. So the best thing that you can do for your soil is have plants in it, period.
Oh my God, you took my question. I was going to ask you about mulch and sing you a song about it.
You have a song about mulch?
Let's talk about mulch, baby. Let's talk about you and weeds. Let's talk about all the good things and the bad things that mulch may be. Let's talk about mulch.
I love it.
Wow.
But you went there because I've always felt that way myself. I live in a condo building. And when I saw the mulch in the garden that we all share, my first thought was like, oh, I don't want that. You know, like it's right up against all the plants. I thought it's going to burn out the plants or I didn't like the look of it or whatever.
Yeah.
But
yeah, let's talk about mulch. I mean, we could have the whole conversation about mulch, and that would be, I think, very productive and useful for anyone who, you know, wants to garden going forward.
Let's dig into it.
Okay. First, I just want to introduce the concept of green mulch. Let's talk about what we want, and then we can talk more about what we don't want, practices that we can abandon. But let's start with the positive, right? So like I said, nature abhors a vacuum. And in the world of ecological garden design, also in permaculture, regenerative agriculture, people are starting to understand that the best thing for the soil is plants. Rather than covering the ground with some non-living object, you can cover the ground with plants, ground covering plants, and they will put their roots down into the soil. When you live in a temperate climate like we do, those roots are going to kind of die back in the wintertime, which is going to leave a little bit of a channel, and that is a channel that water and gases and microbes and insects can walk up and down through, you know. And if you think about like a house has a lot of rooms in it, and if you take a house and you knock it down and you put it in a dumpster, it's not a house anymore. It's a pile of broken building materials. It's the same way with soil. Like functioning soil has a lot of rooms and it has a lot of pores, it has a lot of channels. And that structure is essential. That's why we have the best topsoil, some of the best topsoil in the world in the Midwest, because we've had all these prairie plants that have just been created because they have these massive and deep root systems, and because a portion of those roots die back every winter, that just leaves these open channels. And by the way, it takes hundreds of years to develop that, and it takes a few hours to destroy it when you dig up topsoil, you know.
Well, let's say you have bought some native plants, or, you know, you scored some from a friend or whatever, and you want to have this dense landscape. You don't want them to be like on top of each other though, right? Or do you?
I kind of do. I mean, generally when I plant a new garden, on average, I'm planting things about 1 foot on center. So the center of one plant is about 1 foot from the center of the next plant.
So that space in between, what about that?
So those plants are gonna fill in.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, they'll grow. I mean, and it depends. And this is why it really helps to start to get to know the plants individually, because plants grow and spread in different ways, right? Some plants are rhizomatous and they just fill out that space immediately. Other plants have a taproot, and first thing they're doing is they're sending something down, and maybe it doesn't really bunch out, but maybe the leaves at the top of the plant kind of fold over and shade out. I mean, there's going to be some bare soil, you know, in between, but ultimately you want these plants to kind of crash into each other and mingle with each other. And the more you know about how these plants interact with each other in nature and what their habits are in terms of spreading. Do they reseed around? Do they send runners out? That will help you create relative stability in your garden. Because if you plant a bunch of plants that are very slow to establish and are very shy and retiring, with something super aggressive like goldenrod or asters, well, guess what? It will be a very short time before you have nothing but goldenrod or asters in your garden. You know, so it's useful to know that kind of thing. If a plant is ultimately going to become 3 feet wide, well, then I'll create more space in between that. Unless it's a plant that grows up really tall and then the width is all like way above the ground, well, then maybe it's fine to have things come in underneath.
Yeah.
My sister-in-law in Denver, this is the first time I had seen something other than mulch being used where it's a plant. She used a crawling or creeping thyme in her parkway, and dogs would walk on it and people would walk on it. It was really hardy, and it also sent up this beautiful smell.
Yeah, that is a very popular and very effective ground cover for situations that are really tough, because it's super tough, it spreads, and it's nice between like patio cracks and things like that, you know.
It's so beautiful too.
So it is, and there are
And
many
what is
species.
what is the one native to here that
There is
the
not thyme.
no.
I mean, there are a lot of native ground covers that can serve similar functions. I mean, the big filler plant is carex, you know, sedges. There's many species of sedges. But first, if I could, I'd really like to talk about a theory of native plant communities and a theory of design that came from naturalistic planting design, which doesn't necessarily mean native plants. So you may have heard of Piet Oudolf, who's a very, very famous Dutch planting designer.
Is that how you say his name?
I believe so.
Okay, good. So he planted the Lurie Garden in Chicago, for example.
He was a designer of the High Line in New York, Lurie Garden, Belle Isle in Detroit, all over the world. And he has been one of the forerunners of this movement of naturalistic planting design, which is gardens that are meant for pleasure and beauty, but they emulate the more organic looking dynamic of natural plant communities. That's without respect to being native plants or not. I mean, you can have a naturalistic garden that is 100% plants from another continent. So it really is about an aesthetic, but it looks at the layers of natural plant communities. And this was outlined really beautifully in a book by Claudia West and Thomas Rainier called Planting in a Post-Wild World. So there's a concept called a matrix planting. The basic elements of a matrix planting are the structure plants, the seasonal interest plants. So those are the plants that have a really striking bloom at a certain time of year that say, oh gosh, it's May. Look what's blooming in May. Oh, look, it's midsummer, the coneflowers are blooming, the black-eyed Susans. Oh, you know, my gosh, it's August and we see the asters, we see the goldenrod. That's where your eye starts to move around the garden, you know, during the course of the season. And then you have the matrix layer, which is the filler plants, the plants that cover the ground underneath. So that's the basic structure. And so something that I think about when I'm designing a garden, I always think about those layers. Right? What are the structure plants? Those, you know, the garden is always going to have a certain shape. What are the seasonal interest plants? And then what are the matrix plants, the ground covers? You know, I have like these lists of plants and I kind of tag them that way. You know, it kind of keeps me honest. Like sedges are a great example of a matrix plant. And sedges are all the rage in gardening now. The most popular sedge for gardening is Pennsylvania or oak sedge, Carex pennsylvanica. It's widely available. It does well in shade to part sun. It's really tolerant. So it looks like grass, but it's more bunchy, and it kind of flops over. It has this nice little mound. It gets to be maybe like a foot high and a foot wide. So that is a great thing to fill in between plants. You know, another thing that I use in my garden is wild strawberry, which is pretty aggressive. So, you know, like I'm having to take a lot of it out and put it somewhere else. But it's great. It just fills in the ground cover. It's semi-evergreen, and it's a native plant.
People with shady gardens, we're still in the mix with native plants, aren't we?
Absolutely. Right. Everyone thinks when they think about native plants, they think about prairies and prairie plants, but we have woodlands also and savannas. And our woodlands and savannas are full of shade-tolerant plants. Sedges are a really important component. You know, we tend to think more about the grasses, the prairie grasses, when you're in the full sun, and sedges when you're in the shade. Wild ginger is a great shade-loving ground cover. There's a lot of plants like wild geranium, a lot of the spring flowers that bloom, you know, geranium, Jacob's ladder, phlox, woodland phlox. You know, those flowers go away, but then the foliage remains really alive and interesting. Back to the mulch question. So the ideal mulch is plants, right? And even if you're a vegetable gardener, people put like little lettuce seeds in between their other plants or something like that, you know, to just shade out the weed seeds and keep, you know, benefiting the soil. When you first plant a new garden, you know, you have a foot or more in between plants. Well, it still is a good idea to put some mulch down because it's going to help retain soil moisture and it will help shade out the weed seeds and it can condition the soil. I mean, some degree of even wood mulch it degrades and it sends organic matter into the soil. The thing about wood mulch is that the decomposition of wood requires nitrogen, and so it actually pulls nitrogen out of the soil. The other thing is when you pile wood mulch up against plants, and this includes the base of trees, it can rot the base of those plants. So crown rot around perennials, and we've seen like volcano mulching around the base of a tree, that is going to shorten the life of that tree because the bark eventually is going to rot, and that will girdle the tree because the tree gets all of its nutrients through the cambium layer, which is right underneath the bark. And so it's basically like cutting the throat of the tree over the long term.
So if you absolutely feel like you need to mulch in the beginning phase, are you going for a specific type of wood mulch, or you're doing like some kind of other compost mulch or something? Or?
Ideally, I look for leaf mulch, which is not available at every garden center, but a growing number of garden centers will carry it. The idea is that leaf litter is really what plants, native plants especially, are accustomed to living in, right? That's what happens. Nobody rakes the woods, as Roy Diblick says, great plantsman from Northwind Perennial Farms. Nobody takes a leaf blower to the woods. You know, the leaves decay and they add organic matter to the soil. They shade out the weed seed bank. They keep the moisture intact. You can have leaf mulch just from your own leaves. You know, so the great thing is if you have leaves on site and you can throw them into your perennial beds in the fall, I mean, it can be overdone. You don't want to like put, 3 feet of leaves on top of it, but leaf litter over your turf grass will kill the grass. But most perennials will be fine if you put leaf litter. In fact, that's really the best thing that you can do.
Isn't that great for also insects? And
yes,
they get their habitat maintained. And
exactly. So that's why the ideal is if you just keep your leaves on site, then those insects that have laid their eggs under there or that are overwintering under there, they continue to carry out their life cycle.
Yeah, like to continue with the kind of violent metaphors that we've talked about with cutting the neck of cutting the throat of the tree.
Right.
The other thing that I've heard is that like mowing the leaves, you are like chopping up insects as you go.
Right. Yeah. And people sometimes put their leaves through the shredder to move along the decomposition process.
Right.
I just rubbed my eye and killed a bunch of spiders on my eyelashes. I'm just saying, life abounds.
Well, look, there's a continuum, right? Between a garden, which is like 100% managed in every degree by humans, where every last leaf is, dead leaf is pulled away, everything is watered, everything is totally managed. And then at the other hand, you have wilderness, where people are not getting involved at all. There's like a big spectrum in between. Yeah. And so what's happening in the world of gardening, and what I really recommend, is that people just move a little bit closer, as much as they feel comfortable, towards less management, more cues from nature. Like, we are in the business of winning friends. Like, this is a big PR game. You want people to love native plants. And so if that means that what you have to do is garden with them in a way that's a little bit tidier, it is still a whole lot better than not using them at all, right? And just getting people used to the idea, like getting people to recognize what these species even are.
Maybe even just identifying them.
Absolutely.
Because then people stop and go, oh, that's this special thing that's called this, and I can look into it.
I think signage is great. Identifying things is great because people love what they know. People will love what they know, and then they will protect what they love.
Yeah.
Quote of the pod. Are you ready to share your plant reveal?
All right. This is really tough because there are so many wonderful plants to reveal, but I'm just going to talk about one that's been on my mind lately, but I think is just starting to kind of make its way around in more popular circles. And it's called Amsonia. It's a genus of plants called Amsoniatabernaemontana. So the Amsonia that is native to our region is called amsoniatabernaemontana, which is called willowleafbluestar. And this is a flowering perennial. It flowers in May and June. And it's
so it's an early one, which is nice.
Relatively early. It's a bushy plant that has kind of fine foliage, and then it has these little clusters of blue star-like flowers at the top. And when it's mature, it takes a number of years to really mature. It could be maybe like 3 to 4 feet high, and given enough time, it could become 4 or 5 feet wide. So it's really...
So it can be kind of a bushy...
It can be quite bushy. So the flowers are lovely, very cheerful, kind of twinkly, sparkly plants, blossoms in the spring. But after the flowers go away, the foliage is just beautiful. And it is a really significant presence in the garden because the foliage is somewhat fine. Structurally, it has kind of a similar function to some prairie grasses in that it's kind of, a big bushy plant. But there's a lot of prairie grasses that either are really too big for small gardens or that will really flop in rich soil because they're accustomed to growing in really lean prairie soils. And so Amsonia, it's going to retain like a really big bushy presence. And then in fall, it turns a beautiful yellow. So you get great fall color out of this.
Very nice. And what kind of sunlight does it need?
Full to partial.
Okay.
Full to partial, yeah. And it needs like a little bit of moisture. Like, this is not a plant for your super dry hell strips, but it's tough. It doesn't really need a lot, and it is a great combiner with other plants, so you get a lot of like volume and a little bit of color in the spring, which is nice. But then your other later flowering plants can kind of come up around it, and then it makes a nice backdrop.
Oh, that sounds great.
Yeah.
And just real quick, partial means what? Partial light?
Partial means 4 to 6 hours a day of sunlight. 6 hours or more of direct sunlight a day is considered full sun. 4 to 6 hours a day is considered partial sun, and less than 4 hours a day is considered shade. And sometimes people think, oh, this is a totally sunny site, because they're generally going outside at one time of day when the sun is totally blazing hot. But if it's only 3 hours a day, then that's still not enough hours to support the plants that really require more hours than that. So, you know, as far as whether it's eastern or western exposure, you know, play around with it.
Okay.
I mean, that's how
And
we
isn't
learn,
that,
right?
Yeah. Isn't
Yeah.
that like such a part of gardening is playing?
Absolutely. Yeah.
It's very experimental.
You have to make mistakes.
Yeah.
I mean, the more mistakes you make, the more you'll learn.
Right. Angela, thank you so much. FYI, folks, we've put a list of resources that Angela strongly recommends in the summary part of the podcast. So you can check that out. And then, but Angela, what is your website?
My website is bowman-gardens.com.
All right.
Yep, find her there, and thank you. This was really informative.
Yeah.
Thanks for
Really
having me.
appreciate it. All right, folks, we'll see you on the flip side.
Yep, talk to you soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye.